I'm Dwayne Schultes. Welcome to this Vital Health podcast. Kirsten Axelsen is an economist specializing in Medicare reimbursement, payer negotiations, and innovative reimbursement contracts. She is a fellow of the Aspen Institute and a visiting scholar with the American Enterprise Institute. Kirsten, it's always great to see you. How are you doing?
It's great to see you too, Dwayne. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
So last year, many in the biopharma world that you and I work with were expressing optimism that the Trump administration would be a reprieve from the Biden administration and a lot of the tax, the Inflation Reduction Act, and things like that. 6 months in, do you think this optimism was misplaced?
You can count me out of the many who are expressing optimism. Donald Trump won and has been very successful with a populist platform. Being against high drug prices is very popular. In his first term, did attempt to put in most favored nation pricing pilot, has consistently had a message of fairness, that he feels the prices that are charged outside of the U.S. relative to the U.S. is unfair policy, and has also had a number of years to think about what went wrong in the most favored nation approach attempted in the last term. Unfortunately, being against drug prices has now become a bipartisan issue. I understand why. Nobody wants to be sick and not be able to afford their medicine. We have set up a structure for our insurers that is in many ways untenable, asking them to cover the short-term costs of innovative medicines within a year without an ability to sort of reap the benefits of the investment as patients pass from one insurance type to another and ultimately end up in Medicare. This is sort of a predictable outcome of a world where we've had tremendous scientific innovation, meaning now a small share of drugs with high price tags are very difficult to manage by insurers and even more difficult to manage by individuals facing high copays, and really no innovation in the policy that regulates our insurance. Innovative medicines moved at a faster pace in a competitive private market. Insurance regulation is a government process and hasn't really moved.
Obviously, one thing that occurred with the Inflation Reduction Act when it was passed in the summer of 2022 was it changed the way Medicare handled reimbursement, because in the catastrophic phase, generally, Medicare was covering 80% of that payment, and now it's fallen 60% now is square on the back and catastrophic for the insurance. There were a lot of people saying, oh, this is fine, Medicare Advantage can manage it, but you saw UHC posted a 20% loss unexpectedly. How much of this is just benefit redesign and people not doing the math and squaring their sums?
The benefit redesign went into place very quickly. There's no transition period.
No, none at all.
The 80% subsidy was perhaps too high. It was put in at a time where there was a real concern that the plans would, not want people with very serious illness and do things to keep them from joining, like using restrictive formularies. It was taken off in an instant with very little transition ability. I mean, there's the subsidy for try to keep the premiums low, the pilot that's in effect right now. I think anybody who was observing this market, either who is somebody who studies the insurance markets or studies the drug markets, knew this was going to happen, right? There's only so many levers. You either have premiums go up or you don't cover drugs. And some drugs are required to be covered. There are minimum requirements based on certain therapeutic classes, but also just overall in Medicare. And so it's inevitable that plans are either going to go out of business or they're going to cover fewer drugs. And I think we've seen a huge exodus of the standalone drug plans, the PDPs, which is a problem for a number of reasons. There is more enrollment in Medicare Advantage prescription drug plans, but they're not available in every part of the country, especially rural areas. PDPs are available in the entire state. So we have a situation where there's a real inequity of access depending on where you live in the country, and getting healthcare in rural areas is already harder. This massive decline and quick decline in the subsidy is going to hurt certain people more. The Medicare benefit was designed so that if your drug wasn't covered on your plan, you could switch to another plan. Well, when you get to an area where there's two PDPs available and they're both struggling to manage these new catastrophic expenses, they're very likely not going to cover certain drugs, especially drugs for higher cost drugs such as those for rare disease that aren't required to be covered, just covered as part of the 6 protected classes.
And part of the problem, it appears, is, okay, well, we can't allow premiums to go up, so we're going to put this regulation in place where, okay, magically, boom, we pull out a wand, premiums can't go up. Well, what do you do if you've suddenly then thrown the insurer on the hook for 60% of the cost from where before they were paying 15%? It seems like something's got to give somewhere. Did the politicians just not consider this, or was it just, we're going to play politics and this is popular? Where did this lay?
As far as I can tell, and very much in contrast to when the Affordable Care Act was created, there was very little industry input. This law materialized very quickly. The IRA reflects, I think, a real naivety around how insurance markets work and how drug coverage works and how drug development works. Either it wasn't considered or people just didn't know enough to be able to appreciate you can't step on the balloon in two places and
bring an ice pick.
Exactly. All of us, like I said, you, me, everybody else who was studying this said premiums are going to go up, drug coverage is going to go down, especially on the drugs that aren't required to be covered that are for serious illness, because all of a sudden you have a plan dealing with a very expensive person who may have a rare disease they can do nothing about, and they're going to have a much harder time dealing with that cost. It's kind of similar to the way the price controls were put in at one time for small molecules and one time for large molecules. It reflects a huge lack of understanding of how drug markets work. Even if you hate drug companies, even if you think all the prices should be controlled, I can't think of a worse way to have designed the price controls. I actually think at random would have been a great way to do it if you felt you had to have price controls so there was less distortion to the market.
Just flip a coin, get a small child and a quarter and sort of throw darts and say, okay, we're going to negotiate this one.
Exactly.
You may be right. Now, we walked around IRA a bit. Let's just roll this back and go a little bit more helicopter view. What was IRA, at least rhetorically, when the bill was being walked through Congress and Senate in 2022, when Joe Manchin and Biden and Schumer had cut the deal, basically to take Build Back Better and make it Inflation Reduction Act? What was it supposed to do? What was it supposed to accomplish?
Save money for the federal government and correct some distortion. The amount the federal government was spending in subsidizing the catastrophic coverage in Medicare had been growing and growing rapidly, and essentially was making plans cost insensitive to higher cost drugs. That was accomplished, I would argue, maybe moved in a bit too quickly. I think it was intended to scratch a popular itch that the government would control the prices of drugs just the way they do in other countries. In reality, we saw with the first 10 medicines that were selected, there wasn't much savings. It was largely offset by the billions that were spent to subsidize the premiums that went up. And I think we're going to see, as the additional drugs have their price controls, either limited cost savings because there's already an out-of-pocket cap, or other distorting effects of how drugs are covered. It accomplished a number of things in terms of patient out-of-pocket costs. I do think the $2,000 out-of-pocket cap, or some sort of an out-of-pocket cap, was an appropriate and necessary measure, and price controls on the drugs were maybe part of what, and the reduction in the catastrophic subsidy were part of what helped fund the out-of-pocket maximum. I mean, you could say you may have been able to accomplish this without the price controls if you had, for example, a income gradated out-of-pocket cap, or there were probably other ways of getting to this that might have not had such a distorting effect, in particular on small molecules in the program.
Yeah, and one of the challenges with the Inflation Reduction Act that you've alluded to, and we did a study on it called the Inflation Reduction Act's Impact on Early Stage Venture Capital Investments. If you look at the early side where investors are coming in now, because you have this disparity, this 9 years for small molecules before they're negotiated, and this 13 years for large molecules before they're negotiated, this creates enormous profit disincentives for venture capitalists from a risk standpoint, because the majority of these, even if they're great assets and great teams, 90% of them fail. And so you're already taking a 1 in 10 shot on goal to succeed, and then you're saying, oh, and we're going to reduce your potential profit by 50%. Now, we're not seeing an exodus in the phase 3 stuff. So companies that have gone all in, they've actually taken things to phase 3. They're continuing to bring them to market. But what we're seeing is in the early stage where people can pivot and move away, we are detecting that shift. Why do you think this was not picked up by a lot of the analysis? Because CBO, when they gave their assessment, said, oh, we're only going to lose 2 drugs every 10 years. You had all of the CEOs parading, 2 months after the bill was passed, going to JP Morgan that January. Oh, no, we don't think there's going to be a problem. And there was like a common sense issue in DC where it's like, oh, heck, this isn't going to be that bad. But now we're seeing it is bad. Why did people get it so wrong?
When you think about what the CBO was asked to do, which is essentially could be a lifetime's work of economic research and has been for many people, right? Like, look at all the greats that have studied this for years, decades, and attempted to quantify the impact of market size on investment and innovation. And we have a range of estimates, and we don't know with 100% certainty that none of them are right. The approach to take to this is more like the one you did, which is, of course, was post hoc. You couldn't use it forecasting, but to really think deeply about, venture investment. I don't think anyone, no matter how smart, no matter how capable, could have developed a model that forecast such a seismic change in the world's biggest market. And the CBO was tasked with doing that. Again, I think with very little industry input. I don't know how many people on your team worked on your model, but I suspect you had more manpower on yours than the one that was asked to forecast this huge implications for the world's leading market for drugs. So the model definitely has some limitations. My main beef with the model and how it's communicated is just the way it's been communicated as though that's the fact. It's 8 drugs, it's 30 drugs, that's it. And again, I think that's how the CBO is asked to communicate to Congress. There's no ranges, there's no bands of uncertainty. But no, that wouldn't get published in any academic journal, right? So to me, it's more how Congress uses this information and directing the CBO to communicate the information. It's probably somewhere between 300 drugs and 3 drugs. I mean, look, it's possible that the industry just switches to doing different types of drug development and we lose small molecule innovation, for example. Like, we don't really know. So I think that's why it was gotten wrong so early on. In a post hoc world, some people looked at earnings statements for the big companies right after the IRA. Well, like you said, anything phase 3, probably even phase 2 is going to be continued. What we're going to see is the post-market research not get done.
Yeah.
And then I think the venture investment, as you saw, and I've read your study, is very hard. It takes a lot of manpower and a lot of time.
You're right. I think that's hard to do. And I think with the CBO, the big challenge they had was a time one. They had to get this done, so they did everything based on elasticities and of market demand, which is an aggregate model. But unfortunately, people like Peter Kolchinsky and Steve Potts and John LaMattina, they're not investing in the aggregate. They're investing in a specific asset that has a specific mechanism of action and addresses a specific population. And that's hard to do. Unfortunately, a lot of people as well are economists at the large scale, and they're not invested in drugs. What do you think is going to happen now, because we are seeing this NME problem, this new molecular entity issue versus the biologics? We are seeing companies getting shy early stage to bring an NME to Medicare if it's going to have a lot of Medicare exposure. There's another challenge here because biologics, they don't have rebates and they're more expensive. Basically, Medicare is going to get hit twice. They're going to have higher cost of drugs, higher cost of delivery, and they're not going to have the rebates to subsidize premiums. What's going to happen here? Where does the rubber hit the road?
I think we will see an impact on small molecule development, both in terms of less willingness to bring a therapy to the market. Now, I think the argument I've heard is, it's just the marginal drugs. Again, I would encourage people who believe that to, as much as they feel they can trust them, talk to people who are in the business of drug development. You don't know a marginal drug in phase 1. You might not know a marginal drug in phase 2. And
often phase 3.
Often phase 3. And sometimes you don't know a marginal drug till it's on the market and it fails, which, again, I would argue getting a drug on the market that fails to be successful commercially because it wasn't good enough for patient health is better than having it never get through clinical development, because you learn something from that, the world learns something from that, and some of that competition might just bring down some prices in a multi-therapeutic area. So I do think it is a pretty serious thing that some NMEs might not make it through the drug development pathway. If there is a shift to biologics, it's a real problem, right? Like, we don't have a lot of uptake of biosimilars in this country. They're often not on the formulary. This is not a patent issue. There are multiple products where there are multiple biosimilars approved, and they're not being placed on the formulary. They're not being used because sort of the financial incentives aren't there. So it's going to really increase costs. The other concern I have with the Medicare price controls is if you push down the market size, you're not going to have generic competition either.
Yeah.
So these big drugs, Eliquis, Xarelto, some of these huge blockbusters who already had deep discounts, typically when those drugs went off patent, you would have the deep discounts go away. They're now very high. There's a big delta between that and the generic, and we switch over to generics. Well, now the government's pushed down the price, so there's less of an incentive to even enter the market as a generic, especially because there's price inflation penalties on them too. If we don't have a robust generics market, we have a real cost problem here. I mean, we're sitting in a world where at some point we're going to have generic Hep C medicines.
Yeah.
That's an incredible world. We don't have generic heart surgeons. We need generic drugs to keep down costs, and we need uptake of biosimilars to take down costs. And this law is the opposite of creating incentives for that kind of competition.
And the problem is when you do the math on this and you look at the benefit redesign and then you start looking at the biologic world and the biosimilar world, you start realizing there's very little incentive for an insurer to swap to even a biosimilar where they're getting it at the marginal cost. What you're going to see under the new design, the only way that they do not lose money is if they actually produce it and own it themselves and rebate back to themselves. That's the only way in that value chain. When you actually run all the numbers and do all the math, you realize, oh, hey, wait a minute, they're still losing money at this rock bottom price now. And in fact, the only way that stops is if they were to cut a deal and start making their own products. And what are you seeing? Blue Cross Blue Shield now has a partnership to develop their own Humira. UHC is developing their own biologics and biosimilars. There's a reason why. It's because that's where the incentives are running. So not only are you going to get fewer generics, the ones you're going to get, or the biosimilars, are going to be owned in channel, and it's like you're going to be buying not Tide anymore. You're going to get Walmart's version of Tide, and it's your new biologic. Again, just complete missing of the incentives, the way the market works. How does that get fixed? Can it get fixed?
I've always thought the copay on biosimilars should be low, like the copay on generics is, right? You could do a number of that, create more incentives for the use of biosimilars. That doesn't solve your vertical integration problem that you just mentioned, but at least for the uptake of biosimilars. I mean, get rid of the price controls in Medicare would be one way to fix it. Create rewards or incentives for launching a biosimilar that maybe could be transferred to a biologic. I don't know. There's all kinds of tricks in the basket, but how many times do we need to observe government price controls creating market monopolies for a few companies to understand that's what government price controls do?
Yeah.
And so this is completely predictable.
I went to your panel at ASCO in Chicago. You mentioned earlier the issue of follow-on research. What are you finding on follow-on research and some of the knock-on impacts of IRA, some of these tertiary and quartile impacts that people have missed? What are we looking at right now?
So we've evaluated this for oncology medicines, for example. The work I've done so far has been sort of in a forecasting way. If you were to look historically at oncology medicines, a huge percentage of them have post-market research for additional indications for children and combination therapy. So, with forecast models, we're anticipating that a lot of that would go away. People say, oh, it won't go away entirely. There's still post-market studies for generic drugs. That's true. But that tends to be in either NIH-funded research or companies that are big and continue to give back by continuing to do studies, for example, on like an antibiotic in sub-Saharan Africa, that kind of thing. So, yes, you still do see post-market research without a profit incentive, but you see a lot more post-market research with a profit incentive when you can expand the population. So I think we're going to see less of that. I think we're going to see more niche product innovation, which is fine if that's the right thing for science. If it's being done to avoid getting enough revenue to hit the IRA, those are going to be some expensive, tiny drugs. And with what we know about the human genome, you could essentially create thousands of small market drugs and avoid this government incentive. Again, fine if it improves health. Not fine if it's just a costly way to avoid this distortionary policy.
Now, one of the things that's been rolled out to sort of fix some of these disincentives was the EPIC Act, The idea that it would move the 9 and 13 pill penalty is quoted by Peter Kolchinsky. What's interesting is the bill doesn't actually say it has to move to 13-13. It could be 11-11, could be 9-9. And with this administration, I mean, game on. Who knows where it ends up? Theoretically, I think we're all assuming it's going to be 13-13. Now, it was not included in reconciliation. What do you think are the possibilities of this actually getting picked up by Congress in the next, before the midterms in 18 months?
Whether it comes back and gets passed into law is hard because it will cost money. And we have a lot of other big costly things to manage right now, right? Like the ACA subsidies, for example. We're going to start to see the impact of the Medicaid cuts, and, you can keep going on. So I think it is an uphill battle in the near term. And when I testified before the Senate Finance Committee last spring, I suggested something, Epic Act-like. You could even do 13 for everybody in Medicare, right? You could get to a place where it's not particularly distortionary. You typically see drugs go off patent after 13 to 14 years.
Yeah.
You'd create some incentive structure for a generic or a biosimilar to enter that, 13 years, either you've got an active generic or biosimilar in the market, or your price goes down to 20% of FSS, whatever it is, something predictable. You don't need then billions of dollars and a ton of infrastructure to do this charade of price setting. And the reason I say I think it's a charade is because there's a price ceiling. And when there's a price ceiling, by definition, you can't have a value-based price, right? You can't tell me I'll pay whatever you want for your car, not more than $500, and it'll be a great deal for you. Think of what the drug companies must be investing into this negotiation process.
Time, effort, and energy alone.
Yes. Right. And CMS personnel, and I guess no one's crying for the drug companies having to waste money on this, but it could go back to shareholders, it could go back into R&D, it could go towards a number of places, and then you would also help investors if you just said, like, this is the plan. In Medicare, you get 13 years. That's it. So I do think there are other ways to scratch this itch that would be less distorting to small molecules.
It's a simple fix in Hatch-Waxman. Europe has 15 years. You get 10 years under your patent, and then you get a supplementary patent certificate, an SPC that gives you up to 5 years. You get 15 years. I don't hear anyone complaining that 15 years is too long or too short, because 15 years, that's vast majority of the small molecules are there for 15 years. Okay, the give back is, all right, you're going to lose a few years on your biologics, which have generally gotten 20 or 21. Okay, that's the deal. That's the pay for. And also, what's interesting, your comment about IRA and going into the Epic Act and the fact it costs money. I guess one of the benefits of the CBO lowballing the impact so much is the give back, $8 billion or $10 billion or $13 billion, I think. It's something pretty small. I guess that's the upside of having the math so bad. It's, the pay for is actually pretty cheap, but I'm interested to see if it comes up. I know there was some traction there. A lot of it got mixed in with MFN. Most favored nations, which is this idea that we're going to put an 85% reduction in the market. President Trump threatened a 200% tariff on the biopharma sector, trying to force manufacturing and intellectual property out of primarily Ireland and other jurisdictions back to the U.S. Now, there's supposedly tariff exemptions in the EU deal that's been negotiated. Are these exemptions legit? What are you hearing on the ground? I mean, this is your wheelhouse more than mine. Where are we at with this?
I'll start by saying anyone who tells you they can predict what's going to happen in this administration is lying to you. And certainly as somebody who spends a good amount of her time and gets her income as a biopharma consultant, I would suggest if someone tells you with any certainty they can predict it, that you shouldn't hire them, including me, which is why I'm going to say it's hard to know. If we sort of follow how our president has acted, there have typically been big threats followed by some concessions. The industry, individual companies have laid out some of the concerns they have with European and other Japanese, Australian, other countries' pricing approaches. So again, I have not seen details yet on how drugs are or are not implicated in initial trade talks. I don't think MFN and the concept of equalizing U.S. and other countries' prices is going away. It's been around with President Trump for a long time, and there was a lot of years to work on it. I think we are likely to see some sort of a CMMI pilot materialize, and I think we're likely to see this continue to be a point of contention in trade talks. If I were being optimistic, I would love to see the points of contention focus more on what is objectionable in the systems as opposed to actually equalizing the price, such as the delay in review times, the amount of time it takes to get a product reimbursed after it's launched in Europe, for example, the clawbacks, which are very hard to manage and unpredictable, budget caps. Those are the kinds of things I think we should be focused on, like the procedural issues, as opposed to just saying we need to get the prices the same. Because frankly, I don't even know how you logistically do that. Like, who goes first? Does Germany price your drug first, and then in the U.S. you agree not to go above that? It's typically been the U.S. first. So I think saying they have to be the same is tricky, whereas focusing on things that are really underappreciating value in drugs is a better policy way to go, although it may not be as emotionally satisfying.
We've released a couple initial studies. We're about to roll out a larger one. And if you look at the numbers related to the 2019 executive order, and if you use that as sort of your base, you find that the country that's most likely to be priced, if you use the basket of countries and then you look for the lowest price in the basket, according to the regulation, it's Luxembourg, and it's 85% lower. You start running the math on what happens to the global ecosystem if you roll out an 85% price reduction, even for the top 50 drugs. You very quickly get to half of the industry revenue. You're literally at 47%. The top 50 drugs are roughly half of the revenue that's generated just from the 50 drugs that you're going to be looking at in the context of Medicare. I mean, it's an enormous hit. It's an absolutely enormous hit. Even if it's just 46% of the market is in Medicare, we calculated 59% in our investment analysis. So if you're looking at 85 times 59, you're basically there. It's 501%. I mean, you're literally at 50%. You're talking millions of jobs lost, 2.6 million jobs. The industry is basically gone. In the model, venture capital drops more than 147% if you just use, a regression and look at the elasticity. I mean, it just gets eviscerated. Given the fact that a company under no circumstances be willing to take hits of that size, trading Luxembourg, a country of less than 1 million people, for the U.S. market of 330 million, isn't there just going to be a domino? Why would you even enter the market? You're just not going to do it.
I think we're far more likely to see loss of access in Europe and Australia, in Japan. Those are big markets, as opposed to companies willing to take that hit on the U.S. market, which is not only a big market, it's a more profitable market relative to other parts of the world. So, we already see very few rare disease drugs launched in Greece, for example. It's not good for global innovation to have the pie get smaller. Ideally, you would like to see the prices come down a bit in the U.S. and go up a bit more in other markets, which I understand is this administration's goal. But I don't think you can do that with price controls and price referencing. I really think you have to do that by going after the fundamental problems with some of these price evaluation systems that have either hard budget caps or use measures that are just always going to come down to price that's much lower than the value of the drug, which is why price controls are a pretty tricky idea. And I realize we're probably paying too much for some drugs in the U.S. We're probably paying too little for some drugs in the U.S., but there's not a political or a budgetary focus on those negotiations. And I say negotiations with air quotes, like you would see in markets with centralized price controls.
Let's say you try to do a bona fide negotiation. What power does an individual company have negotiating with a monopsonist government who has the power of a gun and the power of a purse? I mean, it just seems like you have no leverage at all. This only works if the administration puts this as part of their trade negotiations, which is why it was interesting to hear, at least I've not seen anything written down, but it is fascinating that, okay, we've exempted pharmaceutical tariffs as part of the negotiation. That seems to make sense to me. The other question then in this context is, if a company doesn't put that drug in, you run into WTO issues if you don't utilize those patents. I mean, you can see compulsory licensing. You can see, if you don't use the patent, there's nothing to stop a government saying, hey, we grant you the patent. You're not using it. Great. We're going to take it now and we're going to produce this drug because you're not using the patent. The patent is a gift from society to you. If you don't use it, you can lose it under WTO rules, which, the U.S. and all the countries we've been discussing are members. Is there an awareness of these compulsory licensing regulations and these TRIPS waivers that exist in the World Trade Organization context?
I think no is the short answer. No, I think that hasn't, because, hasn't really happened before. it's a serious thing when a country doesn't get access to life-saving drugs, right? And some countries have been willing to live in that world, and patient assistance and other things step in. But with a policy effect of this size, I don't think patient assistance is going to be able to step in and solve the problems. And so you can only imagine what the retaliation is going to be if we end up in a world where either because there is a policy change, there is price referencing, or there is so much threat of it that companies just decide it's not worth it to launch in certain countries because of the threat of price referencing.
Yeah, and you mentioned Greece. From 2012 to today, the market has increased. It's doubled, but it's cost 102% of company revenue. In other words, they've given back in real terms 102% to gain the market 100%. They've lost 2% in real terms. That's through clawbacks and rebates and access agreements. So literally, the industry would have been better off sitting there in 2012 at the IMF bailout going, nah, we're good. We'll just stay where we are now. They would have made the same amount of money. It's bizarre that that's the mechanism that we want to start importing to the United States. I don't think people get how this actually works.
No, you see the hearings, member of Congress holds up the price in Japan, holds up the price in Germany and says, it's lower. Well, for example, watch the GLP-1 drug hearings, like, oh, look at the price in Germany, look at the price in the UK. Well, it's not reimbursed in those systems.
Yeah.
Or in the UK it is, but you have to see an obesity specialist, and there's very few of those. So getting lower prices comes at a cost, and that cost is typically getting access to that medicine. And I think because we're in a world where there's a lot of information, we aren't all experts in every industry. I would say when I read the newspaper, I know if it's misleading in terms of healthcare. I don't know if it's misleading in terms of almost any other topic. And so, of course, people don't appreciate that those countries aren't just getting $200 cancer drugs. Anybody who wants one of them can have one.
One of the other things in the executive order around most favored nations, it punts a lot of the decision-making to HHS, Health and Human Services. Are we potentially running afoul, given the fact that Chevron deference was overturned in the Supreme Court, the idea that you can just punt things to a division and then they're going to make the law like whole cloth? How do they get around the fact that that would likely run afoul of the fact that you can't do that anymore, at least according to the Supreme Court? Does this then just have to park as a demonstration project, and then isn't it going to be much more limited by definition?
It could be, and I can't pretend to be a legal expert at all. I have heard, and I'll repeat what I've heard, that I think the process of making new laws is going to leave less open to interpretation. Much more has to get decided up front, which is both good and bad, right? One of the things that's been good about the implementation, for example, of the Medicare Modernization Act is, things have evolved over time, both through changes in law and in regulation, some for the better, some for the worse. But yeah, if it becomes that, CMS is not allowed to interpret and implement things, we could be in a world where we're just doing infinite pilots, which a lot of these pilots don't save money, don't endure. So I'm not sure that infinite pilots is a great world to be in either.
But it's a great name for a band.
It's a great name for a band.
I've just pulled, in the context of the research we're doing on MFN, I've pulled a bunch of data on Chinese clinical trials because there's increasingly awareness that more and more drugs and INDs, investigational new drugs and applications are coming from Chinese companies themselves going into the FDA. According to our research and looking at the numbers, China now is producing more clinical trials registered with FDA than Europe, and that includes Switzerland and the UK. And at current growth rates, the U.S. is growing about 2.53% per year in aggregate clinical trials. China is growing 25%, which means by 2029, China will be more visible in clinical trials and have a bigger footprint than the United States and the FDA. Arthur Damage from Harvard mentioned in his 2007 study that Europe in 1980 produced 60% of all medicines. Then in 2004, they put in the centralized procedure. They put in very aggressive HTA requirements. The U.S. did the prescription drug benefit and Medicare Part D, and we saw an enormous incentive in transition to the United States and leadership. Is the United States running the risk of doing to ourselves what Europe did to itself 20 years ago and sort of handing the football, whether they mean it or not, to China? Is this where we're going?
I think absolutely right. The U.S. built a huge amount of leadership in clinical trial and drug development for a couple of reasons, right? Educated population, facilities, and the ability to conduct clinical trials. and a profitable market. And whenever possible, it's good to test drugs in your best, most profitable market, because then you get some experience and understanding with the physicians who are later going to prescribe that drug. Now, China doesn't have a particularly profitable market or a high reward in terms of the prices they offer. But what the government of China has done is over decades made a concerted effort to make it a very hospitable market for drug development and clinical trials. You have population willing to enroll in clinical trials. You have the facilities. You have increasing trust. Of course, there's still concerns. And you have, an educated population. And you've also seen sort of initial efforts to protect intellectual property, allow technology transfer so universities can reap some of the benefits of the research they're doing, and the world has followed, right? We're seeing tons of deals done with multinational pharma companies, and it used to be that China developed sort of like the follow-on drugs, the knockoff drugs. Now China is developing drugs for cancer. Even if it's a follow-on drug for cancer, that's, they're still going to be profitable. So, while the U.S. is now increasingly eroding its ability to have the science and the innovative space to conduct clinical trials, China has really grabbed the opportunity. And I think if it continues to get harder to get reimbursed in the U.S., which has traditionally been the market that kind of held up the whole industry, multinational companies are going to be looking for less expensive places to do their drug development. And right now, China is a pretty great option for that.
If you had one recommendation you could make between now and the midterms to try and fix some of the things we've been talking about, what do you think would be the most pressing issue that you think would be the quickest win?
The quickest win would probably be something with the IRA, something like that. But I think it would be the quickest win. If I were thinking about what I think would set the industry on a more sustainable path, it would be focusing on clinical trial innovation in this country, having a interconnected system of clinical trials with a well-established network to enroll people. I think people should be able to be financially rewarded if they do clinical trials. Why not? They're taking time off work, they're getting childcare, pushing what we can do with wearables and remote-enabled clinical trials, real-world evidence, especially for certain types of studies where the mechanism is fairly well understood. To me, that would, if you could make this the fast, relatively inexpensive, but with the highest ethics and certainty place in the world to do clinical trials, which I think there still is probably some uncertainty around the quality in China, do everything that we do well here, plus make it more efficient. To me, that would be the thing that would have the biggest impact on the industry in the long term.
Kirsten Axelsen, always great to speak with you. I hope we can do so again in the near future. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you for having me on your podcast. It was a pleasure for me.
Our editor is Mark Brodeen. Our project manager is Caden Drake. The Vital Health Podcast is a production of Vital Transformation, LLC, copyright 2025.